Hello and welcome everyone to Language Talks. This is a show where we explore the world of languages, literature, and content. Today we are truly privileged to host Dr. Nishi Pulugurtha. She is the head and associate professor in the Department of English at Brahmananda Keshab Chandra College, Kolkata. She is a distinguished poet, author, critic, editor, and translator. Her work spans British Romantic literature, Indian writing in English, diaspora studies, disability studies, and Shakespeare in cinema. With multiple poetry collections, short story volumes, critical works, and editorial projects to her credit, she brings a rare interdisciplinary depth to contemporary literary discourse. Let's talk to her. Hello, Dr. Nishi.
Oh, hello.
Hi, it's an honor to have you on Language Talks. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for making me a part of this show.
You're welcome. I would like to start by asking you, when did you first realize that writing and teaching would become central to your life?
When I was doing my master's, that is when I decided that teaching is something that I would do. And because I had plans of teaching, in college and in the higher education fields, obviously writing predominantly of the academic and critical kind was something that I knew would become a part of my world. And after my master's, I went on to do my PhD immediately after my master's. So that was when I had decided, actually. And the other kind of writing that you speak about, poetry and fiction and other non-fiction that I have been doing, that's something that came much later on, actually. I began by writing on travel, and that was, I think, in 2001. So several years. That was actually 2 years after I joined my first job. So that is when I began. I began it as a kind of a hobby because I was writing about places that I went to. So it was kind of travel, which interests me a lot. So bringing these two things together. But, becoming more and more involved with writing happened sometime in 2018 or so. So much later. So when people say that I began late, so I said, that doesn't matter. I mean, you begin whenever you feel like, and when you get time.
Yeah, that's so true. That is nice to know. You wear many hats, like you're a poet, you're a critic, editor, and translator. So which identity feels closest to your heart?
Oh, that is like something I cannot choose. Right. I do all of this because I enjoy doing it. Right. So professionally, I'm an academic. I've been teaching in this college for now 27 years. So teaching is something that I do, and academics writing is something that I do. And the others I do simply because I enjoy, writing and reading. So it flows from that. So there is no one kind of identity that I could choose.
I see. Okay. So it's all interconnected and you're enjoying everything. I think everything is close to your heart.
Yes. Yes.
Great. Your poetry collections, such as The Real and the Unreal and other poems, and Raindrops on the Periwinkle, they reflect strong thematic concerns. So please tell us more about it.
My journey as a poet began sometime in 2018. I became part of an organization in Kolkata, which is called the Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library. And a year later, I became the secretary of the organization. I'm still the secretary of the Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library. We call it IPPL for short. And I was someone who was very much interested in poetry. My thesis is on poetry, but actually writing, I used to write, but never published it. But then once I became associated with this organization, I began experimenting, writing more and more. And this organization, has been very inspiring to my journey as a poet. And the first poetry collection is the one that you mentioned about The Real and the Unreal and other poems. This was published, I think, in 2021 during the pandemic period. Yes. So I write about things that I see around me. I write about things that affect me. I write about the natural world finds a lot of presence in the poems I write. Things that I see in the urban space that I inhabit. I live in the city of Kolkata, so in a very urban space, but I bring in a lot of these natural, whatever little bit of the natural world that I see comes into my poems. I also have a third volume of poetry called Looking, which was published by Red River, which came out in 2023. And also my travels, my photographs, what I see in the city. I enjoy doing walking in the city, doing heritage walks and things like that, rediscovering my own city. So all of this finds its place in my poems in various ways, in terms of images, in terms of metaphors, in terms of even about what I am writing about in the poems. I also do write poems on a subject which is much more serious and more closer to my heart, and that is on dementia. Right. I have one section in the first volume of poems. I actually have a section called Dementia Poems, where I have 10 poems, which are all based on the subject of dementia. And the reason for that, of course, is my mother had Alzheimer's disease, and I was a primary caregiver. And I also, at one point of time, began to write essays on my caregiving journey, which were published at some point of time. And that is when I decided, I was also engaged with this group of the IPPL that I spoke to you about. And I thought, why not let me write a poem? I took a long time to write a poem where I would bring in, talk about dementia. And the first poem I wrote is called Lost Things, and I shared it on social media. And the way people reacted to that poem, because initially I felt that I couldn't write a poem on that subject. I felt a little bit difficult doing it. But when I saw the way in which people were reacting to it, I understood that I could use, just as I was using my nonfiction to create an awareness, I could use poetry also for the same purpose. So that volume had 10 poems in a different section called Dementia Poems. And the other volume that you talk about, Raindrops on the Periwinkle, that is a volume of short poems, form poems, haiku, haibon, tanka, and they were all written during the pandemic time. That's the first time I was also experimenting with form poems. And because the form poems are a bit restrictive in the sense that there is the syllable count that one has to keep in mind, and the imagery, the kind of imagery that one needs to bring in. So for me, writing these form poems in those pandemic months was a kind of a kind of an exercise, kind of a regime that I was, that it kept me focused, I think, because everything else was so disturbing at that point of time. And some of the poems in that volume are Senru, because they also talk about dementia. Dementia comes in some ways in some of those poems, though I don't have a separate section on dementia, but they are there. So, some people are able to identify. And even in my third volume, which is called Looking, even there, I don't make a separate section on dementia poems, but there are a few poems that speak about the issue, right? And so that's in brief about my poems.
Yeah, thank you for sharing it. And I think this topic is so sensitive and people can relate to it. And you have faced it. So I think that's so relatable. How does your travel shape your literary imagination? You mentioned your travels just now.
Yeah, actually, as I said, I began writing on travel, right? This was in 2001 after a trip to Sikkim with my colleagues. I wrote a piece that was published in a newspaper in Kolkata called The Statesman. And after that, I began to write quite often on travel, even travel close by, to places just beside Kolkata or just a day trip. Even I began to write about all of that. And so travel is something which informs a lot of my writing, even when I'm not writing per se on travel. So even my poems, and even sometimes when I'm writing stories, you will find some elements of travel coming in. into the work that I am doing. So travel is an important work, and I have actually one volume of essays on travel. These were written at various points of time, which I brought together into a volume in 2019. It's called Out in the Open. That's actually my first published book as well. And then during the pandemic, I did another book, an edited volume on travel. So, and then later on, for the past few years, I've actually been doing an academic work on travel writing as well. So, travel is an important part, in spite of the fact that there was a time when I could not travel because my mother, because, I couldn't leave her absolutely alone. So, the only kind of travel I was doing at that point of time was work related, conferences, etc. And my sister would come and stay with my mother. And that is when I actually began to discover these walks in the city. So that was another kind of travel where I'm walking through the city and trying to discover the city differently as well, the very familiar places, their history, their heritage and all of that. And I also enjoy taking photographs a lot. Right. So that and travel are kind of interlinked in many ways. And I need to mention that when Red River, my publisher for the third volume of poems, was working to bring out my volume of poems, I was asked to kind of, the choice of the title of the book, Looking, was because of that, because many of my poems have this looking at something or, some building or at something that's happening. Say it could be a poem that talks about the ghat along the Ganges and the kind scene that is depicted. So many of my, poems emanate from something this, like say for the Howrah station or Howrah Bridge kind of a thing, which is an iconic Kolkata landmark, and it finds its place into the poems. And my publisher at that point of time had asked me to give him some photographs to go with some of the poems he thought were surely inspired by something that I saw. So that volume, Looking, also has some of the photographs that I clicked that go with the poems actually.
Okay, this is so amazing. I mean, so many things you have combined, like photography and heritage walks, travels. This I find very interesting. Now, coming to your Shakespeare work, you have worked extensively on Shakespeare adaptations in Indian cinema. So, what fascinates you most about Shakespeare's afterlives in India?
The way that we've made him our own, right? So, there are certain films which, we have watched much younger, when we were much younger, without even realizing the Shakespeare connection. Or maybe you vaguely remember, like, for instance, Angur, I remember saying that it's Comedy of Errors. And it's something that once again, when I went back to watching it, then the Shakespeare influence becomes even more clear. I watched it the first time when I was much more younger. We've made Shakespeare our own. He's there in almost everything that we do. And it's so universal. You transport the story to India, to a different time, to a different language, and yet it makes sense. Yet it so much feels like what happens all around us. So I think that's very interesting to see the way we have made him our own. We have translated Shakespeare, we have adapted Shakespeare, not just in films, but almost every other. You find him in advertisements. Somewhere you have something. Juliet's I remember a close-up ad where you had a girl on the balcony and the boy below. So you have the typical Romeo and Juliet balcony scene out there. So it's that's very fascinating, and that was how I entered into this world. And I'm somebody who is I love watching films, and so when I began to see this kind of what we are doing with Shakespeare in cinema, and not just in the modern times, but we have it even much earlier on. Even in 1949, you have a Telugu film which uses an element of King Lear and then moves away from it to create a different kind of a format altogether. So the kind of permutations and combinations, and we feel as if, he's one of ours, so we can do. And he lives on in each of these adaptations.
You're so right. I mean, when you mentioned, I remembered that ad. Julius Caesar.
It's a close-up ad. Yeah, I make it a point to mention the ad to my students because to show how much is there in everything.
Absolutely.
Yes.
As someone engaged with diaspora and disability studies, what gaps still exist in current literary scholarship?
In the case of the diaspora, there's been a lot of work that has been happening. They're still happening now. In the case of disability studies, that is something that now we are, into it more and more. And I find several young scholars working in the area, taking it up. So I think that is something that is really very good because there are several elements that we need to talk about. Like, for instance, my most recent book is a co-edited volume of translated short stories called Bandage Moments, which is about stories written by women authors on the subject of mental health, and that also falls into the gamut of disability studies. And we don't talk much about it. So the only reason that me and my co-editor Nagunita Sengupta began work on this is because we thought we needed to speak more and more about these issues, which are so much a part of our world. And we began doing this work during the COVID pandemic time, a time when we were, very much talking about mental health. Also because of my interest and work in the area of dementia. My mother passed away in February 21, but even before I had been part of this organization in Kolkata, which is called Alzheimer's and Related Disorders Society of India, Kolkata chapter. So I used to work with them. I'm still part of the organization. So it's because of all of that, my interest in disability studies and, talking about it is something that is so very much part of, and I think we need to have more and more, I see a lot of young people working in areas of disability studies these days, and I hope that we will have more of it.
Yes, let's hope so. As a translator and editor, what do you see as the biggest challenge in carrying literature across languages and cultures?
Translation is something that I did much later on, even more later on, actually. And yes, and it happened quite casually, but then I found out that I was enjoying doing it, moving between two languages. And as an Indian, I think all of us move between multiple languages at the same point of time. And we do it so very casually that we don't even realize we are moving between languages. So that's how I came into translation. One of the biggest problems that I noticed when it comes to translation is how to retain the essence of the source text while also, retaining the cultural, because when I'm translating into English is a very different language, right? The registers are very, very different. So, and also when I'm translating, I need to make sure that the translated text should be one that is very readable. It should not look as if it has been translated. It needs to, because otherwise, why would one want to read, right? So you will want to read a text which moves very smoothly. So when I was working I was editing this journal for roughly a year called Antonym, which is entirely devoted to translation. And there I saw that there were several translations which were coming in, but then many of them were literal translations, but not all literal translations don't work. So it's important to understand the nuances, and make it readable. Even if there are proverbs, etc., which I use, proverbs, etc., very culture specific, right? But when you translate it into English, it's important to convey the essence of that proverb. So the nuances, and there are several nuances that each language or each text has. So conveying that, I think, is a difficult task, more so when it comes to translations of poetry, which I think is very difficult because in poetry, even the gaps, even the silences, even the, verse, stanza, breaks, even the punctuation, everything kind of matters, makes sense, actually, has something to convey. So, and while editing, so when I was editing translation, these were things that I, when I would read, I would first kind of, whether the story is something that makes sense in the English language, right? So the target, the story in the target language, that is when I translate into English, that story needs to make perfect sense to someone who doesn't understand the language. And I think translation is something very important as well, because in India we have so many languages, and most of us are familiar with maybe 2 or 3 languages, maybe read 2 or 3 languages, but we are not familiar with all the other languages. And because we have so much of a wealth, I think it's very important that we have more and more translations happening in, not just into English, but also in the several, like from Hindi to Bangla, from Marathi to Tamil, even these inter-language ones need to happen, I suppose. But and there are several courses now. There are several departments of translation studies. There are workshops happening, and I hope that more and more people will kind of hone their skills when it comes to translation.
You're right. You've been in this field for so long. So, how would you highlight the importance of learning languages and learning literature or reading literature?
Oh, there is no substitute for reading. Absolutely. Whatever be the field that you're doing, and particularly if you're somebody who is working with literature or who's working with translation or who's working with language, whether even if you're teaching these in school or whatever, I think, or if you want to write something at some point of time or try your hand at writing, I think there is no kind of no better way to do that than to read, and I think reading and learning several languages, several of us do learn other languages also, because I think what literature and language does is that by enabling communication, they're also enabling the spread of culture. The literature talks about empathy, talks about it's a mirror to the human condition. Right. So it's through language that cultures, traditions, all of these stories, all of these move across several people. I think literature is the best way to teach a language, to convey what we are doing. And the more we read, the more better, the way we look at the world will happen. And language also plays a very big role in how we perceive the world, and how we look at the world we live in, and also how we look at others. So, as is very common, speaking, writing, and reading, I think, are essential to. Of course, speaking is essential, but reading is also something very, very essential for everyday life, because it helps, as I tell my students always, because you learn new words, you learn new phrases, and even if you're writing an answer for a college examination, it helps you to know several words and phrases which you can consciously choose, combine, synonyms, etc. So this is absolutely important, right? So language is kind of it's socially and culturally very, very important. And if you can learn several languages, why not? And I think, as I said, as Indians, we move at least 2 languages each of us know. Right. So the more we use these languages, I think the more we also learn about ourselves, our country, things beyond our country.
It enriches us so much. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
What advice would you give to young scholars?
Yeah, read a lot. Yeah, read a lot. Read anything and everything that you can come across, right? And you can read anything. When I teach English students who take up majors in English, and I tell them that, when I ask them to read, I ask them to read any language, because most of them come from the Bengali, they are Bengalis. So I tell them even Bangla literature will do. It's important to read literature. Doesn't matter. If you read English, fine. But if you don't, you're not comfortable, read Bangla literature. Because the more you read, the more your horizons expand, the more you begin to look at things, the more sensitive you begin. And I keep telling them that when you are in semester 1, your sensitivity to the text is at the basic level. But by the time you come to the semester 6 or 7, you yourself will realize that you can read a text and understand it for yourself. So, and this happens because you are reading these texts, because we are teaching you in class how to read these texts as well. So you need to continue, even if you want to take up a career, whether it's a teacher or whether you want to do writing or journalism or whatever, the more you read, the more you hone your skills when it comes to expression, to writing, right? Something that we've always been told as well.
Yeah, right. So which other languages interest you?
My mother tongue is Telugu.
Okay.
Okay. So I speak Telugu, I read Telugu. I also, I of course speak Bangla. Speak, read and write Bangla. And Hindi was my second language. So I speak, read and write Hindi as well. Right. But I've never till now, I have not tried my hand at translating from Hindi. But from Bangla, I have done quite a few right now. And I've recently tried my hand at translating from Telugu as well. So my Bangla actually is better than my Telugu because of the environment that I have grown up in. Right. Yeah. Because I'm located in Kolkata, I move. That is the language that I get to use more.
Right.
Yes, but during the pandemic, I went back to brushing up my Telugu as well. And I have recently just done one translation from Telugu. Okay. So, but it's fascinating to see how each language, because I've been dealing with these two languages, how each language has its own set of registers and how the stories are so very different. They're all speaking about the human condition, but they are so very different in the way in which they have been, structured, in the way the characters come in the way writers tackle different subjects differently. So I find that fascinating.
Oh, that is amazing. So what's on the plate right now? What projects are you working on? What should we look forward to?
There are quite a few which are in the publishing stage. So I have one book on food that is coming up. It should be out maybe this month or maybe next month or, this summer it's going to be out. This is a book on food that I was working for quite some time. So this is a book that is about recipes from a Telugu kitchen in Kolkata. My mother's kitchen in Kolkata, yes. And I also include memories of my growing up in Kolkata in that book as well. It began once again during the COVID as a kind of social media post. People were asking me for recipes and that's how it began. And then it became a serious kind of a work. So that is the one that's forthcoming. I also have written quite a number of essays which are coming together as a book at some point of time. And there's another work that I'm working on right now, which has to do with dementia, which is a book that I hope, a book that is about the dementia experience in India. So it is not a book of stories. It is a book that where you will find first person narratives by caregivers, interviews with professionals in the field. So the also a few essays on films which present dementia in order to kind of give you an idea of how things are, because that is, as I said, an area which is very close to me and is something that I have been working for some time. So I hope I'll finish the manuscript this year.
Okay. I wish you all the best for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, that was a great conversation, Dr. Nishi. Thank you for sharing your insights with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here with this for this series.
Thank you. Bye-bye and have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining me in conversation with Dr. Nishi. See you in the next episode. Till then, have a good day. Bye-bye.